Publishers for the 007 writer Ian Fleming are set to re-release all books by the author with a revised text where offensive language is featured, as well as a sensitivity disclaimer for readers. This disclaimer will read, "This book was written at a time when terms and attitudes which might be considered offensive by modern readers were commonplace. A number of updates have been made in this edition while keeping as close as possible to the original text and the period in which it is set." The wrath of the sensitivity readers first hit children's classic writer Roald Dahl, who said he's going to send the giant crocodile to eat the censors. Never mind. Last week this happened when it was announced his books would be rewritten in line with standards of a more modern, that is to say, boring, tiresome, snowflakey audience. Not my children, who would think this was so condescending, but never mind, I'm not expressing my view, I've got an audience panel to do that. These changes were slammed by the public, forcing Wet Wipes Penguin to keep the collection as it is. This poses the question, are things best kept the old-fashioned way? Well, earlier today, we asked the British people, do you find James Bond offensive? And the people have spoken, and they can probably hum the theme tune better than I can.
It's not offensive because it's a British tradition, let's be honest, you know. It's not something that you're going to take offence to because it's been there since I was born. You know, I'm sure it's going to carry on for another 20 years.
Not at all. It's fantasy. It's not reality. And we shouldn't change books that have been around for quite a few years. New books, yes, we should definitely take stock of what's going in them, but don't change the old.
Well, it doesn't need to be edited because the previous ones are written when they were written and the current ones are up to date with current philosophies anyway, so leave it alone.
It's fantasy, it isn't real. James Bond's a fantasy, isn't it? I mean, he's just some old gentleman who's a spy, isn't he? I don't really know what he is, to tell the truth.
Well, the British people are so sensible. With me to discuss this is Free Speech Union Director Toby Young, and my panel have kindly stayed, so David Starkey and Stephen Pound. Toby, you stand for free speech. Do you think this is right and sensitive, or is it censorship?
I think it is censorship, and I think it's completely bonkers. I mean, instead of trying to adapt classic works of literature, whether by Roald Dahl or Ian Fleming, to make them suitable for the sensibilities of modern readers, surely we should be adapting modern readers so they can appreciate great works of literature in the original. It doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, the social justice warriors here seem to be saying, they seem to want it both ways. On the one hand, Britain's recent past was a racist hellscape, but on the other, they want to airbrush that past to remove any traces of racism. And it doesn't make much sense, to try and make Bond, who is, after all, a murderous sociopath, more morally acceptable by turning him into a non-racist, non-sexist murderous sociopath.
OK, but, Stephen, I watched, for the umpteenth time, the Dambusters recently. And the name of the dog had been very subtly changed to Digger. And I actually thought that was a really sensible, modest change that took out an unusually offensive word that is best not heard under any circumstances.
A subtle way of doing it, but let's not forget, Ian Fleming actually changed the wording in some of his books himself while he was still alive.
Well, that's
in the
Dickens,
second and third edition. Or Dickens constantly rewrote.
Yes.
But, my basic instinct is to be very much with Toby on this, because I think if you're going to actually bowderize a book and emasculate it or eviscerate it, someone's going to publish what's going to be called the classic edition, and it's going to be the unexpurgated, the unbowderized one. However, I have a slightly different view on one aspect. My father had to go into the room where Hindley and Brady murdered at least one child and possibly two. And one of the books he saw on the shelf there was of the Marquis de Sade's 100 Days. And he actually felt, although my father in his day had actually brought copies of Ulysses into the country, he was a great believer in freedom of speech, but he actually felt that there were some books which were just too damn dangerous, like the anarchist's cookbook about making bombs. But that's a totally different thing. That's actually about books which are dangerous. Books which offend this generation, a few people in this generation that didn't offend other people, and who knows whether they're going to offend the next generation. How, in the name of all that's holy, have we got the right to say to our people, you do not have the intelligence or the wit or the strength to actually discern what is good and what is bad? It's wrong.
But Dickens himself updated Oliver because he came to regret making Fagin such an archetype of anti-Semitic thought. Do you think that's right, that an author has the right to change altogether?
Absolute. I mean, you make decisions to change books. I do myself. In other words, as a historian, if I find something that's new, of course, I will change. I'll also, generally speaking, admit, boast even, that I found something new. But that's completely different if an author decides to change. The thing that's so absurd about this particular case, in other words, James Bond is fundamentally opposed to everything of the early 21st century. He is simply a phallus animated and turned into literature.
This is a family show.
Well, remember, we are supposed to be advertising for freedom of speech. So we will, and as I put it, into the semi-obscurity. But that is all it is. The idea, is what Toby was saying, the idea that you can somehow make this respectable is preposterous. The offence is part of the text. Now, you could put forward a different argument, which is that James Bond is mere trash literature, and trash literature is a product, because clearly most of these things now are not owned by the author. They're not even owned by the author's families. They become brands. They become a bit like Coke. They're bought by Netflix or they're bought by some corporation, and therefore they're simply treated as a marketing device. It's an idea which, just like the recipe for Coke can be adjusted to today. So we're talking really about two different ideas of a book, two different ideas of literature. Yours is the classic. I'm saying that in this new age, literature itself has changed. The written word has changed. It becomes merely a streaming product.
I'm very suspicious about that, because I think most authors in Dr. Johnson's term, only a blockhead writes except for money, did it because they wanted to earn a living rather than thinking they were writing classics. But what I want to ask you, Toby,
you want to become classic afterwards.
Doesn't this actually help your case? Because Boulder was ridiculed. Penguin has been made to look absolutely stupid, though they may have boosted sales, and therefore these extreme measures help freedom of speech because the people who are censoring get mocked.
Yes, I think that one of the things which is helping the anti-woke coalition, and I think of all four of us as members of that coalition, is that the wokerati are overreaching. They've become so confident in their kind of supremacy that they're now overreaching and doing things which are antagonising vast swathes of moderate members of the public, as your Vox Pop showed. So I think it is a good sign from that point of view. I mean, to me, Jacob, what this is reminiscent of is a kind of 21st century form of totalitarianism. Instead of burning books like the Nazis did, they're sanitising them. And I'm reminded of that famous quote by C.S. Lewis, which was, "The worst of all tyrannies is a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims. And the only thing worse than living under robber barons is living under omnipotent moral do-gooders."
Stephen, do you think they've made fools of themselves? I'm sorry to keep on calling you a socialist, but you have better connections with the left than the rest of us do. Do they think this is the right thing to do? Are they putting pressure?
This is not necessarily a left or right thing. I mean, probably the greatest attack on this was written by a great socialist, George Orwell, who described in 1984... An old Etonian. I mean, we can forgive him that. He saw the light. But you remember, when he actually said in 1984, there's no past, all the pictures have been painted over, all the books have been rewritten, all the words have been changed, there is no future, there is only the permanent present. I think that's the issue. I think the thing with James Bond, and what's interesting is that the hero of Dr. No is in fact a man called Quarrel. He's a native of the West Indies, he's the heroic figure. However, in that same book there's an expression which I find repulsive, when he talks about the sweet tang of rape. And I don't think anyone would want to have that expression in a book nowadays. I think
that's the whole point. But Bond, David, is the whole point.
David, can I say he took it out?
He took it out, and we agree. The one thing we agree on is that authors are allowed to censor their own work. Thank you, David. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Toby.